Hello, everyone, and welcome to Project Insights Project Management webinar. Topic for today is part 2 of creating requirements in an Agile environment. Just a few things to note before we get started. All participants will be put on mute. However, any questions you have are more than welcome. Please go ahead and type those into your question box, which you can find in your GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll try to answer all of your questions as we go. And also do remember we are going to answer some questions from our first session. So for those of you that asked some of those great questions, we'll be answering those today. Also, this webinar is valid for 1 PDU, free of charge. However, you must be in attendance for the full session. I will email you your PDU certificate by the end of today. So please hold off on emailing me about your certificate until then. And for all other PDU information, please visit our PI community. Type in PDU in the search, and you will find the PMI rules in an article called Webinars and PDUs. I will also go ahead and include that link in your chat box. My name is Denise, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'm on the marketing team here at Project Insight. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please feel free to reach me at denise.rodriguez@projectinsight.com. If you're not already familiar with Project Insight, we're a cloud-based project management solution. We work with two kinds of companies, those that are rapidly growing and need to scale the way they're managing their projects, and those that want greater visibility across their project portfolio, want more insight into the workloads of their resources, and want a better way to collaborate on projects among team members. If any of these sound familiar to you and you would like to learn more, please feel free to contact us via phone, email, or of course, you can always request your demo at projectinsight.net. We would like to welcome our presenter for today, Diane Buckley. Diane is the CEO of Core Performance Concepts. CPC helps companies by training team members in project management, PMP preparation, leadership, business analysis. Diane has an MBA and a PMP and over 30 years of experience in the PM industry. Most of you are very familiar with her. And good morning, Diane. Thank you so much for joining us. She's joining us from Florida today.
That's right. I'm in Florida, and the weather's beautiful. And thanks for having me, as always, Ms. Denise, and welcome everybody to the session. So this is great. I'm looking forward to talking more about requirements today. And let me just share my screen. And do you see that, Denise?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, well, awesome. Well, welcome everybody. We had a great session a couple weeks ago talking about writing requirements in an Agile environment. And today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go over quite a few questions that you guys had that I don't think we got to in our last session about, how do the different methods or methodologies of managing projects work when we're talking about writing requirements and also just in managing those projects. So I had quite a few questions, so hopefully we don't run out of time. We usually do, but hopefully not. But I just want to start again with kind of reiterating what we are talking about when we talk about Agile methodologies. We are talking about an iterative kind of environment where we're not going through a process of writing all the requirements, documenting all those requirements, reviewing all those requirements, signing off on all of those, going to a design session, signing off on design, then going into a build process, then signing off on the build prior to going to testing. We're talking about an environment where we're doing things in much smaller iterations, and that we have a better opportunity to interact with the customer more frequently in order to ensure that when we get to the end, we're giving the customer what they've asked for. And we talked a lot in our last session, the fact that Agile methodologies came out of the need, this particular need of getting the software to the client sooner so you can get some feedback. Too often projects started and went through a long, laborious, requirements gathering and design session only to find out when it actually got into the hands of the client, it wasn't what they were looking for. So that's how the Agile methodology kind of came out. And I look at it, it's just iteration. I want to keep it very simple. It is additional iterations in order to get feedback sooner. And so, when we're talking about the Agile methodology, we talk about having a plan for a release. We talk about, executing on that release plan through iterations, and we get to define the length of those iterations. We have the client define the user stories. We actually go through that execution of the iteration, and then we update the plan, and we get some feedback. And then we continue this cycle until we get to the point where we are delivering on the full project that the client is expecting. And we talked a lot about this last time as well. I want to make sure that people don't have the wrong impression of what an Agile process is. It doesn't eliminate documentation. A lot of people have said in the past, well, I don't need to write requirements because we're going through an Agile process, and that is so far from the truth. It also doesn't mean that you have the most efficient code for your product. It may be, but as we all know, that when you do things in shorter spurts without having all the full knowledge of where you're going, there is some risk to doing more rework, that you might do it one way and then find out later that you have to kind of revise it. So it's not a guarantee, but you do have to realize that. And it's also not a guarantee that you're going to deliver the project in a shorter period of time. It really, truly is about getting to the ultimate goal by having more frequent interactions with the customer so that you can ensure that when you deliver, it's what they actually wanted and will actually satisfy the project charter, the actual goals and objectives of the project. So we will have time to answer additional questions. So as Denise said, please use the question box and continue to ask questions as we go through. My job today is to answer a bunch of questions that you already asked me, but we can certainly insert your questions as we go along here today. Anyway, lots of questions about when is Agile not a good idea? When is it a good idea? Should I use it on fixed cost projects? Should I look at it on variable cost projects, or those with hard deadlines or tight schedules? When is it a good idea? I tell people all the time that the correct answer to any project management question is it depends. And I can see where there are value to an Agile process in any of these, and I can see opportunities or environments that probably not. But if I had to kind of pick a couple and say, when would Agile be the least likely choice for my environment that I live and breathe in, I would probably not have to use an Agile environment if I already have very specific requirements that have been defined. So for example, some of you may work in a government kind of environment. I used to work in defense contracting, and when our organization received the contract to work on a particular project, the definition was already there. There had been weeks and months and maybe even years of discussion on putting together the specifications for that particular project. And if you're project is that well defined, probably not necessary to use an Agile kind of environment. I also lean away from it if there are very hard deadlines, and there's pros and cons to this. Let's say you've got a particular thing that needs to be delivered, and it has to be delivered in a month. Okay, all right, fine. I mean, you've got to, in order to deliver in that month, you probably need to take the time and make sure you got the requirements nailed down in order to deliver in that month. Now, if you said the hard deadline is a year from now, okay, I could probably see where I could leverage some Agile methodologies in order to ensure that I'm delivering a year from now. So it really does depend. So I think there's appropriate application in any scenario, but you have to look at it based on what you're trying to accomplish. You have to look at your budget. You have to look at your resources. You have to look at what you're trying to accomplish and what you're starting with. Is there any other questions that go along with this, guys, that you want me to kind of explore on this conversation? Denise, any questions?
No questions yet.
Okay. All right. So to help you determine when to use Agile and when to use more waterfall, you should think about it in these terms, in the compare and contrast from one to the other. Use your Agile methodologies if you have fixed resources. If I've got dedicated people to work on this project, great. I would lean more towards the waterfall, like I said earlier, if the requirements are fixed. If your client really doesn't necessarily know what features will solve their problem, probably lean towards more of an Agile kind of environment. I see that most companies that I've experienced or had exposure to over the last several years could look at their organization and say, we do a little bit of Agile and we do a little bit of waterfall. And that very few organizations do 100% one or the other nowadays. There's definitely reasons to use one versus the other. And also, if you require constant feedback in order to ensure that you understood the requirements well enough, then use more of an Agile. If your contracts are fixed and any change is going to result in a change request, and that's the contractual agreement that you have, maybe lean more towards waterfall. So again, it does depend. I want you guys to think about the appropriate use of it versus an absolute use of it in any particular situation. So here's a couple other questions that came over from you guys, and I want to answer. And first one is, can Agile work with resources that are shared? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. And it depends on how you're structured. I'm working with an organization that uses a hybrid Agile process. We have a typical waterfall kind of project methodology, but within the technical engineering area, we use more of an Agile. And resources are absolutely shared. But what needs to happen when you do something like that is you need to be coordinating across the resource owners. And when I say resource owners, the different projects that might be utilizing those same shared resources. It's not fair to pit one group against the other. I look at, it goes back to the conversation of prioritization within an organization. Every company has multiple projects going on. There's no doubt there. And some projects are more important to the organization than others. So we really need to make sure that you understand how your project fits into the overall scheme of the organization, and make sure that in the sprint, in the iteration process, you are taking into consideration the priorities of the organization. For example, if there's a large project that's requiring to get into production by the end of June, and you know that it's going to take resources to make sure that that happens, what you don't want to do is have your project circumvent that large initiative. So there needs to be a communication with regard to how those resources are shared. And we all have projects that have tasks in them that can flow. It's really important to know what your critical path is in that kind of environment so that you can accurately and fairly communicate what are the tasks that really need to be done when, and that they can be part of a sprint or not.
Diane?
Yes?
There's a question for you from Carlos. He'd like to know if you think it's a good idea to use Agile for an already running project, and what if the project is facing a crisis because it will not be on time, so meaning the deadline is closer?
Okay. The answer to the first question about being utilized in a project in crisis absolutely can. One of the benefits, the main benefit is that you're getting faster feedback. If you're in crisis mode and you've got a deadline fast approaching, what I would probably be leaning toward is, trying to get some of those resources more dedicated to help resolve it. It is about prioritization. And, I'll give an example. Not exactly what Carlos was saying here, but I've always said that it's really easy to start projects, and it's really hard to finish them. Because what happens when you're trying to finish them is there's all these last little details that don't seem super important, but to kind of put a bow on the project and close the project, you got to get those things done. So if you just toss those seemingly unimportant items out there to get worked on, the priority may not be there. But if you're working to try to get things wrapped up and closed, and if you put a client into production and there's a couple straggling items, I believe that you should have a focused energy on putting that bow around that project, cleaning up all those bottom, last little issues, getting it done. So the same kind of thing holds true with you. What you're saying, Carlos, is when you're getting that close, it's about rallying the troops to make it happen. And you can certainly use an Agile process to do that, but you need the resources more focused on delivering in that environment. So hopefully that answers you, Carlos. So I'm going to go on to this next question. And it says, if you have a true team, there is not the need to write more detailed functional specs since information is conveyed between team members working together. When I'm going to look at the term true team. If we are looking at from a pure standpoint where an Agile project has a dedicated set of resources, I could agree with this person that asked this question or made this statement that you don't necessarily have to write more detailed functional specs because you are working together. However, it is important to document afterwards when you come up with a solution what that solution was. And there's a couple main reasons for that, because we need to be able to train. So you need to understand, people need to understand how it was actually delivered and developed. And we also need to be able to maintain the system. So if we don't document what was actually the result, then you're going to have some failures that will take much longer to fix from a maintenance standpoint. So if you have a true team, and I'm defining a true team as 100% dedicated resources, if there's one person that comes in and out, then that kind of negates the whole thing. Because, in that purest sense of the word, you've got everybody in the same room, all working together. Of course, you're going to sit at the computer side by side, you're going to work through the issues. Do I have to write very detailed functional specs? if we're all sitting in a room trying to solve it together? Absolutely not, but we better be documenting it afterwards. I like these next two. I thought this was kind of a common theme in the questions that came across to me the other week. It says, how do you get an Agile team to commit to a completion date, and how do we manage the overall timeline? And I guess what you're dealing with, the people that ask these questions, I'm imagining what you're dealing with in your organization. And I'm imagining that the technical team is hesitating on giving you a completion date. And I'm imagining that they're hesitating on giving you an estimate as you're, if you're the project manager and you're trying to put your schedules together and they're just hesitating, they're saying, well, we just don't know yet. I chuckled because I think that is just normal, regardless of whether or not you are in an Agile environment or a waterfall environment. If you look at studies that people don't like to commit to things they're not sure that they can achieve. And that's just nature. People just don't like doing. Now, there are people that are okay with it. And those individuals are perfectly comfortable with explaining variances if they don't need it. But a large portion of the population don't like to commit to things that they can't feel comfortable they can deliver. So it is the project manager's job to try to get a sense of what is doable or not doable, and to get a reasonable estimate of completion on various tasks. So if we're thinking about it, well, I'm going to go back to this first question here. How do you get an Agile team to commit to a completion date? Agile teams typically don't have a problem committing to what they want to deliver in a particular week. And I believe this question has to do with the end of the project. So they shouldn't have a problem with telling you what they feel that they can complete within a particular sprint. However, they're probably hesitating with regard to when are we overall going to have this project completed. And what I would suggest from a project management standpoint is look at it maybe in more macro level deliverable. So let's say there's one deliverable that we know we're going to start on some sprints on, and there's 20 requirements for it, and you're trying to understand when that particular deliverable is going to get done. Work on those deliverables, subsets of the project, and PMI, we are allowed to sit there and put a planning package out there that kind of puts a placeholder. You should potentially have an understanding of the expected scope of this project, and you probably know when things are going to go out of whack. So if you've got a budget that says this has to be done in about 5 months, then you've got to plan your project to where it's broken up into major chunks and do some sprints within those major chunks for those deliverables, and be able to escalate when things seem unrealistically delayed. I know that's not a perfect answer, but you're the project manager, and we're always going to have the issue with people not wanting to commit to date. So use the same kinds of skills that you use in a typical waterfall and to make that happen. Things are not running smoothly, and it's seeming like it's going to take longer than what you've got budgeted. All right, well, maybe we get everybody together on a daily basis and really work through these issues a little bit more and try to bring things to closure. That's just normal project management effort that you're going to have to go through to get there. So I don't think the project management timeline stuff changes significantly just because you might be using an Agile methodology. The conversation might be a little bit different, but you should have points where you know when to escalate and get a little bit more attention on something if it doesn't seem to be going the way you want it to go. Any questions on that?
No, but I do have a similar question, kind of just touching on teams. So it says implementing Agile can also be a cultural change within a company/team. How do you make sure your team is on board with this new approach if the team is new to Agile?
Well, it's about sharing with them the benefits. And we should never be changing to something if we don't see that there's a benefit to doing it. So if any kind of change management process would say, okay, well, we know we need to get to here, and currently we recognize that our current processes aren't going to get us there. We're going to leverage Agile methodology, and this is what the expectation is, and this is how your world changes because of it. But we all have to commit that we understand that there's a problem. So if you're just changing it to change it, and you currently don't have any problem, you're absolutely going to have issues. Because if people don't recognize that there's a problem that needs to be solved, then they're not going to want to change. But if you can get people to say that, hey, you know what, things aren't working the way that we want them to, and you can, and everybody agrees with that, then you can offer a alternative like Agile, and everybody agree to give it a try and move it forward. So you're never going to get people to change unless they agree that there's a problem to solve. Excellent question. So last time we kind of talked a bit about user stories and requirements, and this is where we ultimately want to get to. And we had a sample here of putting together a basic story, and we talked a bit about the fact that writing requirements in an Agile environment is a little bit less formal, however, just as valuable and still structured. You're asking for user stories from your client to identify what they want to change. We're asking the client for some details on it, on what it's going to look like when it's done. And we're asking them about some acceptance criteria. So how do we know when we're done? Because if we're putting work into sprints, we need to know what we want to deliver, and how are we going to know that we get there. And it really has to be very objective as to whether or not you've received it. You've gotten where you wanted to go. So writing the acceptance criteria is probably even more important than writing details on the story. To the person's point earlier about if you do have a truly dedicated team, a lot of the details of the story get worked out in the sprint. However, we do need to know whether or not we got there. So having some acceptance criteria is critical. And then identifying who's doing what is just as critical, so that we know that everybody has their role and responsibility defined. So out of that part of the session, got a few questions from the group. One is how to handle non-functional requirements. So non-functional requirements would be things that are not, for lack of a better word, not user-facing. It would be something like performance. It would be something like user-friendly, more subjective kind of requirements. So I look at handling non-functional requirements just the same way as functional requirements. They can certainly come up with a story that says that, what my performance should look like and how much uptime we should have, and there has to be some way to verify and test it. So I don't think there's really any difference from my perspective on functional versus non-functional requirements. The next question that came up was who writes or documents the story? Well, the best person to write that would be the person that's going to receive it and put it in terms that they understand. And there's lots of different tools that are available to help people, document their stories. But it really, ideally, the client is. Now, if you're interviewing the client's telling the stories and you're documenting it, great. But it should be from the voice of the customer is what you really want there. And then the next question is when, where, how do you get the customer to commit to many sessions to get their input and feedback? This was an excellent one. Now, the person that asked earlier about changing over to an Agile process, there are pros and cons, to this. The pros are that we're going to get feedback from the client much more quickly and much more iteratively. And that means that you're going to be asking for feedback more often from the customer. And getting that commitment does take some time. And if your organization is changing over to an Agile environment and haven't discussed that from the perspective of the customer, think about your customers that you have today. And if they're internal customers or external customers, it doesn't matter. Think about the customers that you have today and figure out, is this something that our typical customer would be able to commit to? So it's more than just an internal discussion as to whether or not you want to use an Agile approach versus a waterfall approach. I've worked with customers and clients that demand a particular method to follow. So they demand to have a more structured requirements gathering and design session because of the potential importance or the risk associated with the project. One customer over the years, they had several failed projects with a couple different vendors. And when they finally got to the client that I was working with, they were very clear as to what they wanted, and they wanted to really control how we interacted. So that particular project was very much a more waterfall kind of approach, where we had to have very clear requirements. We had to have the requirements review. We had to have sign-off on that. We had to have, a design session and things like that. So you have to take into consideration the customers you have, and don't assume that your customers will be, ready, willing, and able to do what you want them to do. I think the stat is that 95% of all businesses are less than 100 employees. So, most of those companies don't have the resources, per se, to kind of commit to that. Any questions to this point, Denise?
We're good to go.
Okie dokie. Well, I promised you guys, as when we're talking about requirements, I wanted to go over what's said in the PMI Business Analysis Practitioner's Guide that was published late last year, and what are some of the best practices in writing requirements. And PMI definitely supports iterative methodologies, but they also recognize that we have to make sure that we are writing requirements well. And just because you're doing more iterations does not mean that you're not documenting things. And when you do document things, you want to make sure they follow some guidelines. And as part of that practice guide, they've come up with 9 different attributes of writing good requirements, and I want to go through those with you here today to talk a bit more that we can be better at writing requirements. So the first one was complete and precise. And if you look at the practice guide, I give you a couple examples of, and I'll do the precise and imprecise first. So the imprecise, it says when the department code entered match the department code on file, the system will display an error message. Okay, that's fine. But the more precise requirement would be when the department code entered does not match the department code on file, the system will display invalid department code. So it's being much more specific, very, very clear with regard to what you want. So the attribute of being precise. Complete versus incomplete is a little bit different. And if you look at the example here, it says the card reader shall be of the same dimensions as indicated by the card size and consistent with industry standards. Well, what are they? What are those dimensions? What is that card size? What are the industry standards? So in this particular case, that's not complete. You can't just kind of say, I'm done with that requirement. In this particular case, they basically said that, you know what, we need more clarification. So in order to be complete, I got to get the card reader dimensions, and I got to get it by and who's doing it and what their role is. Also, another example would be where it says terminate a session after the number of incorrect passwords exceeds the maximum allowed. Well, what is the maximum allowed? Now, be very, very specific, very precise, very complete, so that when you read the requirement, it leaves no room for interpretation. And when we're talking about ambiguous or unambiguous, actually that should say ambiguous and correct, so bad on me, because we want, I'm sorry, no, it's right, unambiguous and correct. Unambiguous is good, correct is good. Ambiguous is bad, and incorrect is bad. So ambiguous, when we think about the term ambiguous, what does that mean? What does that mean to us? Well, what PMI says is when we talk about something that's unambiguous, it means that the two individuals agree on the requirement, that they interpret the requirement exactly the same. So to be unambiguous, you need to kind of test to make sure that people understand and interpret it in the exact same way. So if you look here, the ambiguous requirement is kind of a singular sentence. The system shall check the name field to be only alphabetic and the address field to be either alphabetic or numeric, but containing only addresses in the U.S. or Canada, and the quantity field to be only numeric. All right, well, that can be interpreted many different ways. So breaking it up into very small, very complete, very concise requirements makes it unambiguous. So it's basically saying we're going to validate that the name is alphabetic, that the address field is either alphabetic or numeric, that all addresses are in U.S. or Canada only, and the quantity field is numeric. Make sure that there should be no question as to what that is. Another example for ambiguous requirement is the system provides identification of the employee when passing through the reader. All right, what reader? Who's the reader? What are we doing here? When the employee passes through the reader, the system displays the photograph of the employee on the monitor. So again, how are we going to be more clear, making sure that nobody misunderstands these requirements? And correct versus incorrect. One of the things that PMI stresses on this part is if you are documenting a requirement and then you are referencing that requirement later on in the requirement, which is why I say jump from 7 to 11 here, you should state the requirement one time and then reference it. Don't duplicate it in two different places. It only opens yourself up for inconsistencies later on. Somebody goes through section 7, makes a modification to the password must be at least 12 characters in length, not realizing that it is also referenced in section 11, and now you've got your requirements that are not consistent and not accurate. The next thing is consistent, measurable, and feasible. And let's talk a little bit about consistent and inconsistent. If you notice on the left-hand side, we use different starting of definitions or descriptions of the system. The security system, the new security system, the secure card system, the RF security system. Name things once and use the same term over and over and over again. I was actually doing a training the other day for a client, and I had several times talk about how within their system we use different terms for the same thing. Very hard to train systems when we're using different terms for the same thing. It confuses people. People forget what to go back to. They don't remember all that stuff. So it's very important to have consistency in how we document things. And measurable versus non-measurable. It's very similar to when we talk about objectives. It's kind of a yes or no answer. It has to be, did we make it, did we not make it? So, when we say there will be no more than 6 training classes per employee, then, okay, well, what does that mean? Each employee, to make it more measurable, each employee will have not less than 2 and no more than 6 on their, and why, to be put on their professional development profile. I could probably make that a little bit more measurable, a little bit more specific, but I think what they're trying to say here is, they really don't want 0. They really want people to have something, some sort of training class. So they're kind of putting more parameters around it from 2 to 6. And then the last one here is new production lines shall be efficient. It kind of goes to user-friendly. Efficient is too subjective. What is efficiency? What is productivity? What is, the specifics that you want to measure? And it's either a yes or a no answer. The new production line shall produce an average of 5,000 bottle caps per day. And the last, feasible, let me talk about feasible a second. So feasible is one of those things that is fairly vague. And let me see, I got to find it on my, here it is. I want to see what PMI says about it. Feasibility, the focus of the feasibility analysis performed at the forefront of the business analysis work pertains to the work to determine the feasibility of various solutions or options. Feasibility discussed in requirements pertains to the feasibility of each requirement. So it's a very specific thing. So, what PMI is talking about is usually when you start a project, there's a feasibility study, whether or not the goals and objectives of the project can be achieved. When they talk about feasibility as it relates to requirements, we have to get to the point where each individual requirement we feel is we are able to deliver. So if for some reason the measurable requirement is the 5,000 bottle caps per day, and somebody puts that requirement there, and there's somebody within the organization said there's no way that equipment can do that. The maximum available or maximum capability of that piece of equipment would be, 3,000 bottle caps a day. That would make the requirements not feasible. So we should look at the requirements from the perspective of feasibility as well. And the last group I want to talk about is traceable and testable. One of the things that PMI is stressing is traceability requirements. And when we create requirements, we want to make sure it goes back to the source of the requirement. And the source of the requirement is actually the problem we're trying to solve. I'm going to take this back to, Agile. we don't want Agile to be kind of this free-for-all kind of environment where anything goes. We're still trying to solve a business problem. So it doesn't mean that just because I'm in an Agile process, I can develop whatever I want in the week that we're doing our sprint. There's very specific things that we want to try to achieve. Those that product backlog that we talked about is a listing of things we want to deliver. So your requirements should be mapped back to what you want to deliver within the sprint. And it needs to be mapped forward through development to a test case that proves that the requirement was successfully satisfied. This is where I went back to the acceptance criteria. Your requirement needs to match the problem you're trying to solve or the deliverable you're trying to deliver and forward to the test case that proves that you got there. And even if you're sitting in a room with your 10-person team and you're not writing down these requirements per se, whenever you say there's a requirement, you need to be thinking about how it maps backwards and forward. Ideally, you are documenting it, because I would prefer that, but I understand that sometimes you're in the midst of it, but you have to have that conversation. Don't just say, oh, well, I want to change this to blue, and don't have any reason why you want to change it to blue. And testable falls right in line with that. It's a pass-fail. It's a yes or a no. If you can go back to these requirements and say, I've delivered it and check the box, then you are well on your way to being able to deliver on the overall project schedule or project deliverable. Any questions? I went through all those attributes of good requirements. Any questions on that?
Yes, we have a question from Michael. So he says, good requirements are good requirements regardless of methodology, but what's specific to requirements in an Agile process?
What is specific?
Yes. In an Agile process.
I think I just answered that. I mean, when you're working in an Agile process, you have a product backlog, right? You've got all these features that you want to deliver. And each week, when you're setting up your sprint, your iteration, you're identifying the features that you want to deliver. Now, each of those might have some requirements to deliver on that feature. So those requirements need to be spelled out and assigned as to who's doing what, and know whether or not you delivered on them. So I'm a big proponent of you still have to do some level of documentation and detail out the requirements in order to successfully deliver on a sprint. Any other questions?
Yes. Can Agile be used in offshore environment?
The answer is it depends, of course. Yes, it certainly can, and we can kind of sidebar on an offshore development. There's different organizations offshore. Some of them work very well in an Agile environment. Some of them do not. If you're looking at companies to offshore to, and you are an Agile shop, you're going to want to make sure that that organization has experience working in an Agile shop. Similar to the conversation about the customer, if the customer isn't committed to giving you that ongoing feedback, it's going to be really hard. If the vendor isn't committed to supporting that process, it's going to be very hard. So, and I know a lot of vendors will sit there and say, yes, we do, just because they're trying to gain the business. But I would definitely, talk to references and make sure that, you've seen those organizations have seen some success with a particular methodology. And remember that everybody's methodology is similar, but not necessarily the same. So I would ask more questions about, how does it work most successful organization, and before you jump into that, because otherwise, if you're trying to change the vendor in doing a different methodology, you will probably spend more time than you want to, and it's very hard to manage when you're that far away. Awesome. Okay, cool. All right, I've got a couple last questions here before we kind of close it, and we'll see if there's any other questions. Last two questions from the audience from the other week was, how much accuracy can we achieve on triple constraint in Agile projects? Now again, triple constraint is time, cost, quality, time, scope, and cost. And you can put scope / quality together. So where I said earlier, just because we're working in an Agile methodology doesn't mean that we manage projects any differently. The project managers still have to be able to keep their eye on the ball and what is the critical path, and making sure we are delivering to that and escalating things as necessary if things are happening that are putting your critical path at risk. So you can achieve just as much accuracy in either methodology, and the opposite end, you can fail just as easily in either methodology. It really does come down to how well you're managing that critical path and getting the things done that need to get done to the level that's necessary for gaining acceptance. And then the last question here is, are Agile features estimated? That seems to go against the idea that requirements are precise. Should requirements be a little open to allow for an iterative process? And the answer is, in an Agile environment, yeah, you're probably less precise on the requirements when you start that sprint. But that's the whole part of it. It's like you take that week and you say, these are the deliverables we want to do, and as part of that week, you're spelling out those requirements, and you're trying some things, and you're testing some things, and you're going in, as a team and working through them and saying, what, that didn't quite work right, so let's try this, and work through that to get to the ultimate end deliverable for that sprint. So yes, your requirements don't have to be as precise, but you still want them to be accurate. You still want, you're still going to have a conversation about the requirements. And the key thing is to make sure you know when you're done. It's really that acceptance criteria. How do we know that we're done? How do we know that we can close that sprint? Do I know, do I know what the result is? We can get to the result in many different ways. Requirements are ways to get to a result. They can come up with a lot more requirements to deliver on a result than you actually need. But the result is the key thing. So make sure you keep on being able to validate that you delivered on the deliverable that was expected. All right, so we are at the end here, guys. Any other questions before we kind of close this?
Yes, I think we have time for a couple of questions. So here's one. What's the dollar threshold for doing Agile? Is Agile for low-budget projects, say 1 million or less, or can Agile work for larger projects like 20 million and up?
I see a lot of hybrid project methodologies out there. So the answer to your question is it can work. And as I said early on in this session here today, is you need to utilize the tools that you have in your tool belt. And an iterative process is one of those tools. A waterfall process is one of those tools. Think about, the benefits of Agile is when you don't have real clear requirements, but you kind of have more deliverables, you might want to utilize some Agile methods to kind of get to that point. When you have very specific requirements and very specific specifications, probably not. But it really comes down to what you need to deliver, and it is a tool in your tool belt that you can use. So I wouldn't put a dollar threshold on it. Awesome. Well, Denise, I'm going to pass this back to you, my dear.
Thank you very much.
And it's all yours. And thank you, everybody.
All right, guys. Yes, thank you for the great questions and answers. So we do want to see you next month. If you have not already registered for our next webinar in July, please go ahead and do so after the webinar, or we'll also follow up with an email. This is PM in Theory, Realize and Rise Your Potential, 8 Business EQ Strategies. So that's on Wednesday, July 13th at 8 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And Diane, this is a little bit about what you offer, so I'll let you speak a little bit on this slide.
Sure, absolutely. If any of you have enjoyed these webinars and any particular topics and feel like you want to, teach these topics, you feel like you've learned them, you've experienced them, you can actually teach them, we do offer licensing opportunities on about 90 different topics that you can license and deliver in your own organization or for your own, chapter, whatever you're trying to do. Because I know a lot of you like to give back and do some teaching, so we provide you that opportunity.
Great, thank you. And there's also a special promotion from CPC if you'd like to continue improving your project management skills. They're also offering a 10% discount for online courses. So go ahead and check them out today if you're interested. I'm going to go ahead and also include that link in your chat box. And for those on social media, I'd like to invite you to follow, like, and subscribe to our social media channels. Our handle on Twitter is @ProjectInsight. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. I think I skipped my PDU slide, but you will be receiving your PDU certificate via email towards the end of today. For any other questions, comments, feedback, please feel free to reach me at denise.rodriguez at projectinsight.com. And I think that is all. And in our community, you'll find many recorded videos and webinars for you to watch and learn from. You can sign up for your next project management training. We also have leadership webinars, IT methodology, and Agile webinars, as well as product training. Go ahead and check out our webinar calendar and register for as many as you would like. They are all free of charge. And also, for those asking about the presentation, I will send the recording, the link to the recording and the slides by tomorrow. So keep an eye out for your PDU certificate by the end of today and the recording and slides by tomorrow. Good? All right. So that is all we have for you. Thank you, Diane, for a great session, and thank you everybody else who joined us today. We had some great questions, and we hope to see you next time.
See you soon, everybody. Thanks so much.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.